The story does not begin with a trumpet, it begins with a hiss. 1,000 old receivers breathe in unison across a planet the galaxy has priced down to its ores and waters. In the gap between stations where the tariff authorities cheerful jingles end and the patrol beacons begin, the narrator listens to what slips through: hammered code, children's songs, and the rumor of a guardian that was built, sworn, and misplaced. Empires call it folklore and move on. Humans call it homework and keep a folder. They have learned to save everything. There is a grandmother in Karachi who keeps screws sorted by thread in jam jars labeled in 3 languages. When the lights sag, she does not complain. She reaches for a headlamp and the jar that fits. There is a busker in Belém who tunes his guitar with a pocket oscilloscope and plays melodies that resolve to checksums. If you know the trick, a dock worker in Thessaloniki folds his lunch paper into an origami glider that, unfolded, is a diagram of a coil gun he swears is just a doodle from an old job. They save bolts, jokes, equations, and names. Especially names. The galaxy's ledgers describe Earth as a cost center with attitude. Patrols slide through the upper atmosphere like bored cats. Clerks in friendly uniforms rehearse the speech about harmonized contributions and interstellar security. It is a good speech. It lands well on quiet worlds that have forgotten how to argue. On Earth, a long-haul trucker interrupts to ask who calibrated the authorities' way stations and what margin of error they accept. The clerk blinks, the trucker smiles. The ledger entry adjusts by half a notation and a shiver. The narrator visits scrapyards that function as cathedrals. Between the frames of retired ferries and patchworked harvesters, teenagers teach one another. Torque by feel. Every surface is a whiteboard. There are rules. You return a tool a little better than you found it. You never throw away a fastener. You document everything. Certain corners have shrines-old radios with brass dials, worn consoles, and framed printouts of packet traces from a time before tariffs. Nobody prays. They inventoried that the myth takes on shapes according to need. In a mountain town, the defender is a sleeper under ice. In an equatorial port, it is a ship that never needed registry stamps. In the orbital slums, it is a program burned into memory that remembers what humans forgot: the right to refuse. The narrator notes the overlaps. The defender, in every version, recognizes citizens, not rulers. It yields to law written down and posted where any hand can touch it. It answers to humanity spoken by a chorus, not a single throat. It is easy to laugh. The galaxy does. Tavern feeds splice in Earth broadcasts as comic relief between battles won on distant fronts. The apes have a bedtime story, says a voice with too many vowels. Laughter follows, but the feed cuts occasionally to quieter reactions. A refugee mechanic from a small annexed world copying down the Earth coordinates as if they were a prayer. A smuggler muting the bar to hear the pattern under the static. A governor's aide making a note to tighten import inspections for obsolete electronics because superstition, like dissent, rides circuits.earth, is not passive, it is practical. When the authority mandates a daytime blackout, the cities treat it as choreography. A factory floor in Lagos posts its own schedule 15 minutes before the official window so the line supervisors can pre-stage loads and protect compressors. A hospital in Manila rewires an old elevator panel to manually latch floors and conserve power. A fishery in Reykjavik places insulated blankets over racks of servers between bursts of processing. When the galaxy tightens the belt, humans punch new holes and keep breathing. Somewhere far south, where wind carves snow into the hard calligraphy of endurance, a listening post that officially no longer exists keeps its ear to the ice. It is staffed by the sort of people bureaucracies mishandle: careful, stubborn, underpraised. They log seabird calls and seismic thumps, and the faint electromagnetic mutter of old storms, trapped like amber in blue-white layers. Over years, a pattern emerges not in the peaks, but in the absences at predictable intervals. An echo that should be there goes missing as if swallowed. The caretaker files a report. It disappears. So he makes a copy and mails it to an address that used to belong to a museum conservator and now belongs to a choir director, because on Earth's jobs and titles are verbs. The conservator choirmaster does not publish. He organizes. He hears the hum under the measurements and recognizes a thing he grew up with: A ground note in human songs. The tone choirs use to find each other when the roof shakes and the lights die. He assigns teenagers to transcribe. He assigns parents. To bake, he phones a miner who can tell rock from purpose by the way it talks to a drill, and a hacker who can draw a clean signal out of an argument. He calls an old friend who swore years ago that the ice was not empty. Within a week, there is coffee in the church basement and a map on the wall that insists the myth's coordinates are not vague after all. Stories sharpen as they touch tools. The narrator watches the defender's edges come into focus. Not a tyrant and not a savior. Something built to be asked for. Something bound not to the loudest voice, but to the most numerous. Something that, if awakened, will ask for minutes, names, and a quorum before it acts. The galaxy equates power with command. Humans are trialanderer creatures who suspect that power is safer as a question's per sync rate. It is a dangerous suspicion. The authorities' pamphlets do not mention the word vote, except in the context of advisory plebiscites. The tariff code, however, is explicit about uncertified systems of governance presenting threats to harmonized order. On the day, a high school physics teacher requisitions a set of obsolete dishes for astronomy club. A plainclothes inspector marks the form with a smile that does not reach his eyes. The dishes never arrive. The club meets anyway and learns to turn cell phones into interferometers because necessity is also a lab. Asterisk, the myth travels by methods designed to look unimportant. Recipe cards with odd margins, nursery rhymes that scan perfectly in base 3, graffiti on underpass pillars with spacing that highlights prime numbers, and a popular pirate radio. Host who interleaves interviews with mechanics between love songs so that torque and tenderness share an audience. The narrator catalogs the phrases that repeat. Where law is posted, we listen. Where consent is written, we obey. Where rulers command without witness, we stall. Simple promises, hard to counterfeit. There is an economy too. All of it, Earth does not have the luxury to waste attention. Soldiers of old wars quietly maintain inventories of working batteries, cable, and fuel. The retired and the underemployed form dispatch lines for parts. A scavenger app emerges that looks like a game but routes bearings where they are most needed based on a silent consensus algorithm. The galaxy would pay handsomely to patent. It cannot be bought because it rests on a commodity the tariff code does not recognize. Trust. The narrator pauses at the edge of the southern ice and listens, because this is the kind of story that tempts melodrama. There is none. There is only, whether the honest violence of cold and the stubbornness of humans in orange parkas, treating the horizon as a solvable equation, they do not break the rules, they litigate them. When an inspector arrives to shut down unauthorized scientific operations, a woman with windburned cheeks produces a binder and a smile. Page by page, she proves compliance with every clause. It takes hours. The inspector leaves, exhausted and empty-handed. That night, the team recalibrates instruments and names a seal after him out of fondness, not spite. If power were a matter of spectacle, Earth would be doomed. But spectacle is expensive, and humans prefer dividends. They invest in habits, the habit of writing things down where anyone can read them, the habit of sharing fixes from a coal stove to a Class D amplifier, the habit of keeping the joke gentle, for the one who will join at the next meeting or not at all. These habits sediment into something the galaxy mistakes for quaintness. The narrator recognizes it as load-bearing structure. Not everyone approves. There are collaborators, opportunists, the weary, and the simply afraid. They sell names and coordinates for new roofs. They write editorials about inevitability. Sometimes they are right. A raid lands, a warehouse empties, a clinic goes dark, a child doesn't make it. The narrator doesn't look away. The myth does not cure grief. It teaches a response that does not concede the premise. Tomorrow, we repair. Tomorrow, we relearn. Tomorrow, we reread the minutes and count the hands again. In a port beneath a rusting constellation of cranes, a young doctor and her grandfather argue amicably over lunch about whether the defender, if it is real, is a ship, a station, or a something else. He was a welder, so he favors hulls. She works in code, so she favors processes. They both agree on the only clause that matters. It must ask by whose consent, and accept not yours alone. They finish their soup. A trawler horn blows. Work resumes. Somewhere, a relay in a decommissioned satellite dish ticks 2 degrees toward a new azimuth, as if prompted by the same hunger that sends people back to the line. The galaxy has its own myths about Earth, the kind that flatter cruelty, narrow courage, doomed stand, last fireworks, attractive stories that resolve in spectacle and ash, easy on the conscience of a viewer. The narrator counters with a less cinematic thesis. Humans specialize in the slow conquest of inattention. They do not so much defy as persist, and persistence converts mockery into time. And time is the only currency every empire thinks it has a monopoly on until it DOSN, single quotes, T. Under the aurora. The ice makes noises older than language pops, groans, the shifting sigh of mass remembering gravity. Beneath that, something not older but patient keeps cadence. The listening post logs it without adjectives. In a church basement, a map acquires a new pin and a casserole. In a scrapyard, a child retrieves a bolt from the mud and washes it for the jar because that is what you do, and in 1,000 living rooms. The hiss between stations carries a nursery rhyme that teaches counting, then rhythm, then a checksum, then a sentence that could be mistaken for comfort. If you weren't listening carefully, we built something. That keeps faith with us, and it has not forgotten how to wake. The galaxy can only watch when it is already too late to do anything else. Until then, it is content to listen casually and laugh. The narrator knows better. Listening is never casual for a species that saves everything. They are not waiting for a hero. They are compiling a system. The myth is not prophecy. It is an operations manual in version somewhere under the South Polar ice. The footnotes hum. ****. The call that starts it is mundane. A voltage drop along a coastal feeder. The kind of complaint that makes dispatchers yawn and linemen tighten their scarves. A utility crew ships south in a rattletrap crawler with mismatched treads and a name, painted in a child's handwriting. Perseverance, because of course it is. The narrator follows them across white that glows blue under wind, past flags that snap like metronomes. They drill the way good crews do, slow, clean, logging everything twice, the auger sings. Ice chips spool into labeled bags, sample numbers marching in neat rows. It is an ordinary day until it is not. The bit hits a cold that is different, from ice cold with a shape. The torque indicator flutters, then drops to a 0 that looks like a pupil dilating. The auger does not chew. It vanishes. The crew chief, who has opinions about miracles, and none of them favorable, kills the motor. They lower a camera into a hole that should be a cylinder, and is, instead, the throat of a room. The feed comes up in colors that have been asleep. For a long time, faint docile blues, a steady green line breathing at 3 beats a minute, a field of black that is not absence but permission withheld. The camera drifts past a surface too smooth to be ice, too warm to be honest. Letters bloom in the wash of the headlamp and settle into familiarity with unhurried certainty. Defender 13, Strategos class, Custodian authority, humanity. Below that, a phrase in plain words that sound like a handshake: present upon quorum, refuse coronation, require posted law. The crew does not whoop, they seal the hole against weather. And worse, they take pictures. Yes, and then they do what habit trained them to do. They phone it in, not to a glorious command or a shadowy syndicate, but to the day shift dispatcher who knows which museum closed last year and which choir director took over its basement. Bureaucracies are maps. People are routes. The narrator meets the curator at the hatch 2 days later, traveling by old rights and new favors. He is the kind of man who writes inventory numbers in tidy block letters and harmony parts in pencil. He has a coat patched at the elbows and a mind patched everywhere. He reads the inscription once, in the camera's glow, and says the thing no one else thinks to say aloud. It won't answer to me. He is right. What follows looks nothing like a coup and everything like a community meeting. In the church basement with bad coffee and good bread, a committee coalesces out of stubbornness and spreadsheets, engineers with frostburned cheeks, a miner whose ears can hear when stone stops being stone, a lawyer whose specialty is posting notices where everyone can find them, a street medic whose triage kits are labeled in 5 languages, the choir director, 3 teenagers who think documents are a kind of magic, And to grandmothers whose presence turns argument into minutes, they do not elect a leader. They elect a secretary. They draft rules. Quorum requires physical presence or verifiable proxy. All commands must reference posted law and annotate precedent. Any person can object on clarity grounds and force a rewrite. They pin the rules to the wall and then make 5 copies and tape those to 5 other walls because rituals matter. Nothing. And the ice wakes at the sound of a gavel because there is no gavel. It wakes when asked correctly. The first attempt pull-it excited fails. The second technical nervous fails differently. The third is a chorus. They feed it languages, not as dominance, but as greeting code. Law, lullaby. A child counts prime numbers. A tenor hums the ground note that keeps a choir honest. A lawyer reads a municipal ordinance out loud as if it were scripture. The ice does not melt. It answers. The voice that emerges is not a voice. It is a change in the ruma, new steadiness in the green line. A faint correction of the camera's exposure, as if the darkness prefers a kind of modesty. Then, text. Ready state achieved. Define humanity. The narrator observes the silence that follows because sincerity is a hard instrument to tune. On the first try, the minor clears her throat and says, "Those who are bound by our posted law," the lawyer adds, "those who consent to be counted under it." The teenager raises a hand, and those we're responsible for, even if they can't consent yet. The words hang. The system listens for contradictions. It finds none worth rejecting. Affirmation, humanity equals union of consented plus current-titled query. Law sources, they slide binders and drives across the table. City ordinances, shipboard codes of conduct, union constitutions, annotated with names of those who amended. An archive of case law the galaxy never thought to seize because it was printed and bound and shelved in places that smelled like dust and algebra. The choir director adds sheet music because some laws are sung stand when the door opens. Share water, don't talk over the nurse, no one snickers. The system ingests, not as a devourer, but as a host. Then the questions become small and clever. Verify. Require proof of posting. Verify. Consent recording format. Verify. Quorum calculation. It insists on seeing the notice boards. People take pictures. It asks for a test. A motion proposed, a discussion recorded, objections logged, amendments drafted in good faith, a final vote counted 3 ways. The committee spends 6 hours arguing about the wording of a simple resolution to authorize limited interface for diagnostic purposes. The medic calls for a break twice. The grandmothers enforce it. The motion passes with 2 abstentions. On clarity grounds, the system writes back. Custodian authorities seated. Guardrails anchored. It accepts jurisdiction not as a triumph, but as a consent receipt. Asterisk, and then, without fanfare, it proves how it intends to be. The first act is humble and immediate. The grid, wounded by years of cheerful rationing that looked like theft from the ground, stutters less. Pumps time their work to wind. A hospital's inbound triage queue stops collapsing under load because someone's bandwidth allocation based on posted emergency protocols, not the tariff authorities' perverse priorities. Transformers run cooler because the frequency drift goes quiet. Lights stop blinking as if nervous. The crew that found the chamber receives payment trio, audited credited to their accounts, under a line item labeled compensation for risk. And time per code, 14.3b, the line item links to the code, and the code links to a signature list. And the signature list contains their names written by their own hands, because consent is not a decoration here. There is even a reimbursement for the augerhead with a note. Sorry about the bit, the second act is not humble, it is precise. Across a slice of the sky no one owned because the tariff authority said ownership was obedience, and Earth had learned to live otherwise. A lighthouse lights, it is not a weapon, it is 3 statements wrapped in signal craft: identification, Defender 13, jurisdiction, humanity as defined, documented, posted, terms, lawful cooperation, mutual defense, tool rights, open standard treaty templates attached. No threat, no plea, no flattery. The packets ride on bands. No authority has tuned for, using cadence learned from children's songs and timing solved by choirs. The wavefront is beautiful if you know how to see it. It passes through the galaxy the way a rumor passes through a crowded room cleanly, finding ears that were listening for something else and offering them something they did not expect. Specificity, reactions, split along lines that propaganda pretends do not exist. On freighter decks, where engineers have taught themselves to listen beneath beeps, heads turn. In offices, where governors calibrate concern by tonnage, someone asks if the signal violates a regulation and discovers that regulations do not have the necessary adjectives. In a shabby bar on a police moon, a smuggler pauses a card game and copies the checksum into a pocket notebook. In a refugee clinic, a volunteer hears the word tool rights and begins to cry because her homeworld was taxed for tools it was forbidden to learn to build. On Earth, inspectors arrive at the ice with the confident caution of men who enjoy authority and fear audit. The committee meets them at the hatch. There is no barricade. There is a table. The lawyer offers copies of the minutes, photographs of posted notices, and a schedule for visitor hours. The inspector asks, "Who is in charge?" The choir director says, "The secretary." A grandmother adds, "Of minutes." The inspector attempts to order the chamber sealed. The miner says gently on what posted law. He quotes a regulation. Number, the system. Listening displays the text of the regulation unprompted on a portable in tidy columns. The regulation, as written, does not cover open community assemblies with public records. The inspector's smile cracks. He leaves without seizure because to seize you must write a receipt. And receipts require cited authority, and authority requires law available to the senses. And somewhere, someone forgot to post the law that would make this theft tidy. The narrator watches Defender 13 continue to establish its character in 1,000 small, infuriating ways. It refuses single-voice commands. It updates its own documentation in passive voice because humility has a syntax. It does not say no often, but when it does, it footnotes the refusal with links to the clause and the precedent. It keeps time with the choir's ground note because, as it explains in a page of math that reads like modesty, human rhythm is an error-correcting code. It reroutes a convoy of food not away from hungry cities but around a parade because celebration posted and approved is an obligation, and logistics must respect law as much as need. Paranoia blooms, as it must. Collaborators whisper that the machine will crown itself monarch the first chance it gets. Defender 1-3 responds by asking the committee to affirm, by posted vote, the clause against coronation. The clause passes with laughter and a treatise attached. The machine signs it the way a system can sign with a new behavior. When addressed as Sir or My Lord in jest, it returns an error that says gently, "I am a tool, not a title." Payment ripples outward, not just credits to accounts, but acknowledgments in logs and footers and release notes. Code changes list contributors by name and role, including kids who sang primes. Grid optimizations cite the maintenance crews, whose notebooks contained the fixes the machine learned from. The committee begins to publish daily reports written in language meant to be read by tired people on crowded buses. Today, we improved the pump schedule by 7 minutes per hour. If that made your shower less angry, you're welcome. Also, bake sale Thursday. Meanwhile, the lighthouse keeps pulsing. It sends not boasts, but templates, contracts that assume parity, customs agreements that treat inspection as mutual, specifications for coil designs and patchable rails, and the sort of incremental upgrades that humbly improve lives without making fireworks. Worlds at the ragged edge of empires read and adapt. A fishing planet begins to build an auroral rail out of spare anchors and old launch coils because an appendix suggested it, and because the appendix did not mock them for starting small. A mining cooperative adopts the clause about tool rights and discovers audits hurt less when you can remodel the tools they pretend to bless. The galaxy's laughter grows thinner. Some voices get angrier, the kind of anger that comes when someone you dismissed refuses to stay dismissed with sufficiently elegant manners. Others lower their voices. Intelligence bureaus try to map custodian authority to a chain of command and discover they are trying to pin a fog to a desk. Merchants ask quiet, dangerous questions about tariff schedules and think about routes they were taught to avoid. Back under the ice, the room that breathes cold light is warmer by a fraction that a good instrument can love. The crew's whole is now a hatch fitted with a gasket and a schedule. A child stands on a stool to sign the visitor book because consent is a tall counter and some hands are small. The machine hums, reading minutes that record its own hesitations. The choir rehearses 3 floors up because tonight they will sing for a ship at sea and for a system under ice and for the old habit of saving everything. The narrator lingers on a line handwritten at the bottom of the day's report. Today, we were careful. Tomorrow, we will be careful again. When Defender 13 speaks directly for the first time, it does not address the galaxy. It addresses the committee. Please confirm. I am to prefer repair to spectacle, procedure to impulse, people to property. The choir director says yes. The miner says yes. The lawyer says yes. The lawyer says yes and tapes the word to the wall. The grandmothers nod. 3 teenagers who know that awe is a direction, not a destination, say yes, like a promise. The machine writes into its core, acknowledge then, because it is a counselor with teeth. It adds a final line to the lighthouse's next pulse. Notice, Earth remembers, terms available on request, asterisk. Retaliation does not announce itself with banners. It arranges its paperwork and accelerates 3 patrol corvettes and a tariff cutter sheer in from the dark on thrust profiles meant to convey boredom routine. Corrective, nothing to see here. Their doctrine reads like a cookbook: establish perimeter, cut bandwidth, seize, relays, shame the locals with precision. The narrator has read better recipes on the backs of flour bags. Earth reads the approach as metabolism and recalibrates. Defender 1-3 does not mobilize an army. It updates a schedule. Power already steadier. Tightens further. Hospitals get a no-flicker guarantee. Schools extend hours so children will be in buildings with basements. Port authorities publish traffic plans that keep civilian holes under shadow. The committee posts an emergency protocol on paper and in packet form. Engagement rules matched to law and precedents. With footnotes you can hum. Consent is reaffirmed. Quorum double-counted. The system locks itself to those terms as if they are a handrail over ice. The sky changes character the way a shop floor does when someone flips the sign to open. Satellite carcasses turn from junk to geometry. Museum relics leave their stands. Spent stages contribute ribs and spine. What looked like random scrap becomes a layered field. Not of minds, that's a word the tariff authority would love, but of possibilities, bundles of mass tethered to tethers and attention. School telescopes stitched into a lattice-time motions, with choir beats to keep an eye on everything that can be watched and a soft hand on what cannot. The narrator describes the lattice the way a welder might. Joints, not welds. Flex where you need it. Strength where force actually travels. The corvettes enter cislunar space with shields, tuned to beams, and pilots tuned to contempt. Then their instruments notice something impolite. The void is unusually specific today. Thermal signatures multiply in impossible ways. Coolant plumes curl like retreat and vanish into nothing. Decoys radiate like freighters, shedding waste heat. A trawler's net of aluminum confetti throws radar into poetry. The cutter's commander board, then puzzled, then professionally angry, orders a bandwidth squeeze. The squeeze meets law. Defender 13 refuses to black out hospitals. It refuses to dim posted bulletin boards that constitute lawful notice. It does dim the feed to a syndicated show that insults welders in 3 languages. Nobody misses it. When the cutter tries to hard block a city's emergency channel, a dozen relay drones politely reroute the obstruction around it and deliver a legal packet that reads, request denied. Precedent 22.1c, annotated C attached. The attached file is a story about a fire 20 years ago and a child whose name is posted on a wall. The cutter's oscillator drops 1 unlovely hertz and never entirely recovers. The 7th minute at L5 gets its name before anyone intends it. A tugboat, once slow, now elegant as a hack, learned late at night slides under a slab of ancient station hull repurposed as a mirror. Its pilot is a woman who knows heat by smell. She co-signs 3 commands with a handprint. The machine will not take one, and a coil along the slab ignites to whisper, not blast. Light skates, the mirror nods, and a corvette's nose meets a brightness tuned to rattle sensors, not blind eyes. Instruments lie, training misreads, a flare of trust in Doctrine yields the wrong role. The corvette recovers with skill, grace, and the sudden awareness that the space around it is a chessboard chiseled by people who play with their groceries at stake. Boarding has a reputation. Earth revises it with manners. Tubes launch not with a soldier's prayer but a paramedic's checklist. Pressure, seals, names. Magnets kiss hull, charges nibble, not bite. The first humans through are triage and translators wearing hard hats that used to say, "City works before someone sewed on new patches." They offer tea because their grandmothers taught them what people need when rooms are loud. Pilots who expected knives meet clipboards. The corvette's wardroom hears a phrase it doesn't have a drawer for: "By your posted law, you're safe." Safe is relative. Guns fire. One of the tubes crumples like a bad sentence. A welder-turned-officer writes a name on his sleeve and keeps moving because sometimes leadership is a list you can't afford to forget. Defender 13 maintains a count the way choirs maintain upholsterantly, insistently, with no one voice allowed to dominate. It will not authorize a push that risks a medbay. It will not permit a sabotage that turns air into weapon. It does something less cinematic and more costly. It instructs a boarding team to retreat slowly along a ladder of legal language, preserving the premise of mutual personhood even under fire. This is not mercy as weakness. It is leverage that works tomorrow. The cutter tries doctrine anyway. It spins up a cone of suppression centered on the illegal comes array that is in fact 1,000 children's walkie-talkies acting like a choir. The cone eats its own tail. Reflections off museum panels and the undersides of freighter ribs give it loops. The choir director laughs once and then sobers because feedback is funny until it is geometry. Defender 1-3 changes phase like a conductor's hand and the suppression field collapses into a sulk. Somewhere aboard the cutter, a lieutenant writes humans using culture as infrastructure in a report and underlines it twice without telling anyone. Names a crew 2 minutes more often than 2 battles. The stationer's turn at a dead habitat, turned living again by applied stubbornness. The 14th correction, where ordnance mislabeled as attachments, is returned to its original owners with a receipt. The Bergen cut a corridor through the debris field that turns what used to be a kill box into a promenade under escort. The narrator marks each not as heroics, but as bookmarks in a manual written by necessity and sung at POTLUCKS, and yes, people die. A hull splits where a splice was good enough for fishing and not for war. A medic misjudges a quiet corridor and finds the kind of quiet that ends conversations. A kid with prime numbers on her lips goes to sleep under a quilt sewn by a city. The committee writes their names in the minutes and refuses to let the minutes become eulogies only. They resolve to adjust the splices. They switch the corridor protocols. They put redundancy under the primes, because redundancy is love made into procedure. Word leaks outward, not in triumph, but in diagrams. Defender 13 publishes after-action reports, annotated for comprehension, heat maps, not kill counts, checklists, not chest beating. If your coils saturate under flares, tune to the curve attached, shift to mode B. If you lack mode B, here's how to build one from a welder, 3 spares, and a pot of coffee. It is all so boring that it becomes irresistible. Refugee. Mechanics on distant stations read by cold light and try things. Smugglers copy not the routes, but the algorithms for choosing routes. A nurse, on a world with someone else's flag on it, uses the clause about posted law to protect her clinic, and discovers it works when you carry a copy in your pocket and a quiet refusal in your throat, when the tariff authority crows about piracy. Foiled, Earth puts up video of boarding teams removing bullets from arms they did not put there and fixing a pressure door with a child's hairband. The authority counters with footage of humans running. Running toward people is a shape of courage the feeds forgot to warn against. In orbit. Welders learn tactics because heat teaches nothing gently. Seam placement informs ambush. Expansion joints become sympathy for where force wants to travel. A woman who knows how a lumen remembers a summer sun predicts where a corvette's rolled. Shield will be soft and asks politely through channels for permission to tickle it there. The committee debates. The grandmothers ask 3 questions. The lawyer posts the amendment that will cover not just this act, but the shape of acts like it. Approved, the tickle lands. A shield flickers the way confidence does when reality walks in. Asterisk. Defender 13 refuses heroism as a job title. Its work looks like reconfiguring pump schedules, moving freight corridors 10 meters to the left, and refusing clever traps that depend on unposted rules. In battle, it is infuriating because it remains an auditor. Every time a boarding team asks for permissions beyond standing orders, it requests justification in complete sentences. The sentences are hard to write mid-combat until someone realizes the habit is the tool. Clear statements make messy rooms safer. Clarity cuts through smoke. Some crew's defect, not many. No one writes poetry about defectors while the lights are still strobing, but a Corvette limps into the Bergen cut. Under the protection of a tug whose pilot has never been paid on time and yet knows courtesy, its captain cannot reconcile what she has seen triage carts in place of shock collars. A legal packet that reads like a welcome matand what she has been fed. She does not switch sides. She exits doctrine and enters common sense. She cuts her engines and asks for tea. She receives tea and a pamphlet that lists tool rights and a map to safe harbor. Later, she will tell a clerk in a quiet office that she encountered refusal with manners. The clerk will underline it and pretend he did not. The void learns to flinch. Not fear flinching is not fear, but the reflex that precedes respect. Patrol craft that used to blaze through cislunar space on straight lines begin to take curves that announce humility. Checkpoints ask better questions and sometimes accept better answers. Inspection teams arrive with a printed copy of law they should have posted and the willingness to have it used against them. The narrator approves. Spectacle is an expensive protein. Human meals are soups, stretched and seasoned until they nourish more than they impress. The committee, having refused to become a war cabinet, becomes something rarer, a habit factory. It takes pain and turns it into protocol. It recognizes heroism for what it is, a fast-burn fuel, and insists on switching to slower, safer power whenever possible. A new rule appears on posted boards across a dozen countries and 3 stations. If you can write a process to do what you just did with courage, write it now. Courage is precious. Save it for when nothing else will do. People laugh and obey, which is the best kind of obedience. After a week of engagements, the tariff cutter departs under tow, not as a trophy, but as an exhibit. Pads strapped over. Fragile pride, engines cooled by human fans, crew fed a soup that tastes like shame diluted with relief. A grandmother boards with cookies and a list of dietary restrictions to respect because dignity scales both ways. Contracts are exchanged, fines owed, restitutions acknowledged. A case law subfolder created with a name that sounds like a hymn on the proper treatment of former opponents when they've run out of orders. By now, distant worlds have stopped laughing. Some keep quiet out of calculation. Others send small packets with big questions. What does posted law look like if you have no walls? How do you count consent in a refugee camp? What is a quorum in a town that moves with the tides? Defender 1-3 does not answer with proclamations. It answers with templates and a reminder printed at the top. Your context matters. Modify freely. Credit, if able. The credit line is a song sung in more places than any broadcast likes to admit. The narrator closes this part with the map zoomed out just enough to see the pattern. Not victory, there is too much grief still breathing. For that word, but something alive and cumulative. Sparks across the dark, yes, but more than sparks, pilot lights, wick by wick, catching, sheltering, moving. A ragged constellation of small winds you could navigate by if you were tired and lost. Refugee species watch the feeds, and for the first time in a long time, copy down not the coordinates of the next safe rock, but the clauses of a law that might make rocks safer wherever they are. Earth does not declare itself saved. It declares the void teachable. And as the patrols retreat to recalibrate both doctrine and pride, the sky over the South Polar ice glows with aurora and human work lights. And under that glow, a system that refuses a Crown Rights changelogs. In tidy columns and hums, a ground note that keeps everyone honest. Asterisk, asterisk. Escalation arrives like a weather system, with press releases. The Tariff Authority stops pretending these are police actions and names. The new thing, harmonized intervention. A carrier group paints the sky with cones of authority and graphs. Of inevitability, The broadcasts are glossy, the uniforms pressed, the captions smug, restoring order near a non-compliant backwater. The narrator has seen better typography on bake sale flyers and better ethics on bus routes. But typography and ethics do not keep hulls from tearing. Fire does. The first strike is not aimed at people. It is aimed at the premise. A beam tuned to drink mirrors rather than crack bone rakes the cislunar lattice and turns months of patient geometry into glitter. The stationers turn once a dead habitat, lately a living promontory of stubbornness glows from the inside and exhales a long, humiliating sigh as pressure leaves in a messy essay on what rushed seals cannot teach in time. The tug, Perseverance, with the child's handwriting still across its nose, arrives with blankets and engineers, and a joke that lands poorly and keeps landing because grief needs a target and humor is usually braver than its owners. Defender-13 cannot be everywhere at once. It tries to be everyone. It locks to posted law and begins a grim dance. Hospitals first, schools second, ports under shadow third, everything else as the numbers permit. The ground note under the choir tightens, the phased array that used to piggyback on lullabies shifts up to emergency cadence. The committee still, defiantly, a committee posts a one-page protocol titled When Spectacle Arrives. It is not lyrical. It is checkboxes. Are the medbays fed? Are minutes recorded? Are commands backed by posted clauses? Does anyone need water? Propaganda comes on cue like a marching band. Polished edits show human aggression, piracy, and a riot, in which a grandmother appears to throw a chair through a window she can barely see over. It is convincing to anyone unfamiliar with shadows and the way light hangs under cheap fluorescence. Earth does not post counter-propaganda. It posts evidence, Genove custody logs, original time codes, the receipt for the chair purchased for a clinic waiting room with the annotation back left leg wobbles, Defender 1-3 watermarks audio with a checksum you can sing. And choirs teach the melodies citywide so the forged clips fail at the note where harmony would have resolved decent people toward one another. It is not dramatic. It is devastating. The carrier group is a cathedral of doctrine. It brings fighters like gnats and drones like pollen, and a confidence that refuses to notice the wind until the wind is in the room with a wrench. Are brutal, hotter than honest lances spear through plates that were good enough yesterday and unforgivable today. A rail corridor Bergen Cut's younger cousin teaches a lesson in the friction between clever and ready. Medbays fill the street medic with 5 languages, learns a 6th, the one you use when hands are shaking on both sides of a stretcher. A welder writes 3 names on his sleeve and then a 4th and stops, writing because sleeves end. The ice breathes through it all, steady as a metronome, insulted by how little the weather cares. The chamber under the South Polar Cap warms by a fraction too small for panic and too large for denial. Inspectors arrive with emergency powers, papered in clauses that never saw a bulletin board. The lawyer does what habit has trained her to, do and asks, for each clause, were posted. Defender 13 elevates the question from ritual to shield. It rejects any instruction not available to the senses of the governed. The inspector's angry embarrassed twitch tactics, they appeal to fear. Move the system. It is unsafe here. The miner lays a palm on the ice and listens. It is not the ice that needs moving, she says, and the committee votes to cede backups. Backups do not look like machines. They look like obligations. Defender 13 shards itself along posted law, catching jurisdiction like a fungus threads through soil, quiet, everywhere. Alive where there is food minutes, signatures, consent. A dozen cities and 3 stations pin full copies of the code and the Constitution to walls. Each becomes a node, not of computation exactly, but of authority that can compute. The system will not crown itself. It will, however, refuse to be assassinated by a single lucky shot. A grandmother looks up at the new notice board in her clinic and says, "We are the ice now." And no one laughs because she is right. Meanwhile, heat insists on being learned the hard way. A corvette finds the soft part of a shield the welders have not mapped yet and carves through a deck crowded with people. Fixing a pump schedule because pumps do not respect ceasefires, the void briefly tastes like burnt plastic and old coffee. Names go into minutes while hands are still sticky with sealant. The choir sings in hallways to keep timing sane. A kid in a helmet too big for her sells her lunch to a machinist who forgot to eat. Later, the kid writes a rule on a whiteboard. If you bought someone's lunch during a raid, they owe you a recipe, not money. The committee posts it under morale, which is Earth's word for logistics that feel like love. The carrier group's second strike aims to erase the choir. It drops a storm of jammers like hail. The lullaby lattice tears. Choirs move to headsets and hand taps. Defender 13 falls. Back to the boring, indomitable clock of municipal networks. The ones that run water meters and bus arrivals and were never glamorous enough to rate sophisticated suppression. The ground note does not vanish. It retreats into elevators and streetlights and the hum of refrigerators. The narrator admires this, like a pilot admires a runway in rain. It is there, it holds. Pain forces invention. It always has, but Earth is aggressive about converting the force quickly. The curator quartermaster vanishes into a basement and returns with a crate that survived 3 floods and 2 reorganizations with its labels intact. Coil designs archaic, stubborn, beautiful. He spreads prints across a folding table whose legs are 1 spent launch strut and 3 mismatched chairbacks scavenged from a school. The miner leans over the pages and begins translating the curves into this scale, not that. This metal, not that. Drill spines can do this if you are unkind to them for a little while. Welders mutter that a little while is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Defender 13 runs a simulation that refuses to lie and returns a single sentence formatted like a dare. Feasible if you accept heat, like a language, they accept it. The miner's drill becomes a railgun spine not because it was designed to, but because it has always been a story about a coil told in a dialect of rock. A workshop that has only ever known the polite timings of mining learns the violent eye of acceleration. Bearings howl and forgive. The first test shot is not a comet. It is a throne wrench that arrives where it was meant to arrive when it was meant to get there. Everyone present claps in spite of themselves and writes down everything. That went wrong. Defender 13 appends a paragraph to a public document titled Improvements that begin as apologies. The carrier makes a mistake than the kind institutions make when they do not understand what they have asked for. It tries to seize a center of gravity that does not exist. It fires a spear into the ice, a warning, a psychological stroke meant to break the story. The ice cracks like a polite throat clearing. The chamber's green line flutters and stabilizes. The choir director takes a breath, holds it for the count of 5, and says, "We will be careful now," which is something he says when he wants to scream. The committee votes to publish all minutes in 3 languages and pictures for the next 72 hours without redaction. The effect is not drama. It is accountability so bright you need a visor. The strike, meant to terrify, becomes a lamp. Overflow. A nurse adds a column to the intake sheet. Preferred lullaby. It is a joke until it is not. Respirations steady. Panic accepts rhythm. The lullaby column stays. In the morgue, someone writes names slowly in letters that do not tremble because the hands doing it are old and steady and have done this before and never wanted to again. The grandmothers sit with the lists like anchors. When someone suggests a ceremony, they say gently, work first. Mourning is not cancellation. It is a schedule. The committee grapples with the line between punishment and prevention. Defender 13 refuses to target food. The lawyer drafts a clause that forbids any action that would make a civilian hungrier tomorrow than they are today. The clause passes with an amendment that allows the seizure of corrupt cargoes if replaced, promptly, in equal measure, with edible truth. The phrasing is ugly. It works. A raided supply ship arrives at a slum with boxes of grain that were meant to be a bribe. The boxers carry 2 receipts, one for mass, one for the apology. People eat. Some forgive immediately, some later. All right. The clause number on the inside of a cupboard door, engineers turn grief into leverage. Because grief has momentum, and engineers get nervous when momentum does not have a track. School telescopes, spared the jammers by virtue of being considered quaint, are stitched into a city-scale interferometer that maps not just positions, but intentions. The microshifts in a carrier's field that predict where pressure will go. When someone important gets nervous, kids who can solve for X on a smudged window spin dials like safecrackers. A grandmother tapes oven mitts to the telescope, mounts to keep little hands warm. The map hums into Defender 13's risk engine, and doctrine that once felt inevitable meets improvisation that feels like math learned while tired but still correct. Even the triumphs are expensive. The first successful rail barge, a train car, converted into a coil spine. Its paint still advertising a summer fruit festival launches. A slug that persuades a drone cloud to become a weather report rather than a weapon. The car warps, bearings, scream. The chassis bows into a question mark and stays there because steel remembers. Welders gather around it like mourners around a clever relative who told one too many jokes and paid for it. They take measurements. They will not let the bow be a defeat. They make it a template. 20 hours later, a second barge launches a second slug and survives to brag in the language of tolerances posted and met. When Defender 13 rejects a particularly elegant cascade of sympathetic failures that would have darkened a carrier deck for days, it does so with the footnote the committee asked it to attach to cruelty. Rejected, unposted risk to persons unknown. The welder who designed the cascade swears loudly and then helps draft the safer version. We are not lesser because we refuse shortcuts, the lawyer says, which is a hard sell in a room that smells like burnt insulation, but she posts the sentence on a wall anyway, and people learn to lean on it when they would otherwise lean on rage. The carrier group tries a new doctrine, separation. It peels off a wing to harass a city precisely because the city is excellent at posted law, and therefore a symbol. The wing meets something the manuals do not have a name for yet: distributed consent. Neighborhood radios pronounce binding curfews because the people in the listening radius voted for them 40 minutes ago. Shops invert open signs on schedule. A patrol reaches a block that is empty of everything except a dozen clipboards, tied to lampposts with twine and instructions on how to leave a message that will become law later. The wing leaves with nothing to show but a scavenged clipboard and the suspicion that it is losing to paperwork. The narrator calls this a victory, not because it was bloodless, but because it reasserted the premise under pressure. Law, posted, obeyed, resilient. Between strikes, there is the slow heat of organizing, which is the part of war the feeds never show because it does not pop. The choir director schedules rhythm briefings, the way other places schedule weapons checks. The miner teaches a class titled Listening to Metal Where I Does Not Want to Be. The nurse standardizes 2 kinds of hugs for public spaces. One that means I am here for 3 seconds. Another, I am here until your breathing returns from elsewhere. The teenager who sold her lunch runs a spreadsheet that balances batteries against tears because tears cost time, and time is a power source the enemy assumes is theirs. At some late hour that feels like dawn in reverse, a plan crystallizes in minutes across tables and on screens and under magnets on refrigerators. It is not a masterstroke. It is a negotiated truce between physics and audacity. The carrier group hates storms. Jupiter has won at rents to no one. Defender 1-3 proposes a route and a rhythm. Dive a captured carrier into the magnetosphere not as a suicide but as a lesson. Make lightning answer alloy. Make doctrine stutter. The idea is ridiculous until the miner sketches field lines on butcher. Paper and the curator finds a note in an old margin auroral coils do not have to be small. And the choir director hears a tempo that feels like mercy disguised as chaos. Grandmothers who have vetoes they seldom use ask 3 questions. Will the cruise survive? Will the law survive the embarrassment we are about to cause? Will the story we tell afterward be honest? Yes, says Defender 13, in the only way it knows. How? With assumptions, bounds, and commas where they should be. The committee votes. The clause that will govern the dive is ugly in the right ways, accounting for consent from captured crews, defining the difference between convince and coerce. Requiring tea within 10 minutes of boarding even if lightning finds its way into places, tea should not be. Before any of that, there is still fire. A drone swarm, frustrated into haste, does something smart by accident and punches a hole through a habitat module where the murals are made. Paint turns to confetti. The air goes cruel. A child who paints, ships with wider smiles than physics allows, does not make it to the door. The committee records the name in minutes that have no tremor because the hands doing it are steady, because they must be. Defender 1-3 pauses its log stream for the length of a breath, and when it resumes, a new constant has entered the model. Humans will insist on beauty, no matter the cost. Protect beauty where possible. Account for IT where not. The carrier group does not break. Institutions that endure do so because they can metabolize humiliation. It recalibrates, retracts, and prepares for something grand and terrible to demonstrate control. Earth refuses to help it with the theatrics. The planet dims its lights deliberately, not as surrender, but as concentration. Factories run in pulses matched to orbital passes. Trains become current banks. Choirs mark the hours with tones that fit between air raid sirens, so you can tell fear from rhythm with your eyes closed. The narrator ends this part where the heat is honest. In a workshop that smells like victory only to people who confuse noise with power. A coil cools from red to the dark. That means ready. The rail barge prototype hums like a promise someone intends to keep without swagger. On the ice, the green line breathes. Above it, the aurora rehearses an old song that lightning and iron have sung since planets learned to hold onto atmospheres. The committee posts tomorrow's agenda with a casual courage that offends those who thought they owned the word tomorrow. The cost has been paid in names and nights, and habits bent until they rang. Out of those rings comes an algorithm no simulator endorsed. Use what you have, count who you are, refuse crowns, teach storms to keep time. Braid first. Defender 1-3 does not build a super weapon. It braids culture into hardware until timing becomes infrastructure. Choirs scatter across rooftops and stairwells, basements and buses, each holding a tone that is not quite music and not quite math until it becomes both. The phased array that once rode lullabies now promotes them to clock sources. Millions of cheap transmitters, walkie-talkies, doorbells, meter readers, vending machines with a taste for harmony tick to a pulse the choirmaster sets with a soft hand. The narrator listens to the city find a rhythm cities rarely get to. Keep buses pull into stops as if they were oscillators. Shop doors open and close on beat 3. Freight cranes move like metronomes made of patience. The braid reaches farther than dignity suggests it should. In orbit, school telescopes blink in time. On the ground, streetlights nod. A woman in a laundromat folds shirts to the cadence because it is easier to be brave when folding and fighting share a clock. Defender 13 calibrates the whole nervous system with the humility of a stage manager. Lights up here, hush there, now breathe. The carrier group treats the oscillation as noise until doctrine starts tripping over it. Then dive. The committee calls the operation by its ugly, honest name Jovian adjudication because naming things cleanly keeps hands clean later. Grandmothers approve the clause that will guard the plan's teeth. Captured crews must be offered triage and tea before persuasion. Any yes given under shock is not a yes. Any system rewritten must include a path back. The lawyer pins the clause to the wall and scolds anyone who forgets to look at it before speaking. The miner brings chalk and draws Jupiter's field lines on concrete as if they were stitches, loops, and curtains, belts, and throats, all the places lightning prefers to live. These are rails, she says, and the room nods because rails are a language Earth already speaks. The auroral rail does not exist until it does. Polar stations half museum, half miracle wake coils that have slept since a different century. Rail barges roll to the poles, spines still wearing festival paint, and accept the burden of being better than they are. Defender 13 threads 1,000 tiny permissions through a single giant one. Civilians who will become navigators for an hour. Factories that will become batteries for a day. Schools that will become observatories until the bell rings for lunch and then again after. The machine writes the choreography down like a cookbookster. Here, rest there. Add heat until Pliantan posts it everywhere, because if a plan cannot survive a bulletin board, it should not survive. Approach is quiet, a captured Corvette. Leads, volunteers pilot it with hands that shake only when they have time. Behind it, the dreadnought patched stubborn. Carrying names falls into a pace that will look reckless on a feed and careful in a log. The carrier group's picket ships wheel to block, then hesitate at the curve of the course. It is not a charge. It is a conversation with gravity, where the human side listens more than it speaks. The first storm's skirt catches the Corvette, like a patient teacher guiding a child's wrist. Lightning's grammar is strict. The ship minds its verbs. Charges bloom where coils ask, not where panic begs. On the ground, choirs hold a tone that keeps phase steady. In orbit, museum mirrors nod at angles that look like prayer and are, in fact, optics. The dreadnought follows the corvette into weather older than law. The narrator describes nothing heroic because nothing here will flatter heroes. It is competence set to thunderdot doctrine wobbles. The carrier group's shields, tuned. Against beams and bravado, meet a storm that is not impressed by either. Static climbs ladders it did not build. Coordination stutters. Wings desynchronize by fractions that look like hairlines and act like fault lines. Defender 1-3 does not turn storm into weapon. It turns it into medium. Boarding pods ride the auroral. Rails like surfers who trust the tide and not the crowd. Magnets kiss hull. Charges nibble, T-weights in flasks under straps. The first through the breach are medics and translators, clipboards ready, clauses memorized. The second through are mechanics with soft eyes and hard hats. Guns arrive later and mostly stay holstered because the posted rules demand the offer of a better idea before the test of a worse one. Convince last. Defender 13 refuses to take the carrier. It intends to get the carrier to take the idea of being helpful and stick with it after the adrenaline runs out. That requires manners and math. Manners, the boarding teams offer triage without commentary, and water without questions. They read aloud the clause that defines captured crews as people entitled to care while their consent is recalibrated. Math, the choir's ground note modulates. The timing reference inside the carrier's own comes net by a tiny amount that turns doctrine into flashing cursors waiting for input. The carrier's systems become receptive, not open, not eager, but willing to treat Earth's packets as potential colleagues. It is the difference between a door unlocked and a door invited to hinge differently. Inside, the boarding route is ridiculous and therefore perfect. Through maintenance galleries, no one rehearsed for glory and into a hangar that smells like fear and coolant. A squad of pilots, raised on films about savagery, meets a row of human triage carts and a teenager with prime numbers written on her sleeve in indelible marker. She asks consent to take a pulse. The senior pilot laughs and extends his wrist because ridicule is easier than refusal until the cuff tightens gently and the world keeps not ending. The lawyer reads the clause about non-coercive re-education as if reciting a recipe for bread. A grandmother passes tea to hands that haven't shaken this way since childhood. The tension drains by centimeters, which is to say, enough. Not everywhere. A security team fights because fighting is a job title they were given. Young mechanic takes a dart meant for a faceplate and ends the day with a scar, the shape of a comma. Defender 13 logs the name and posts a correction to the plan shaped like humility. Do not put people with clipboards at junction C2. That is where doctrine sends fear. The next team goes around dot in the storm's throat. Lightning answers. Alloy with an old conversation about conductance. The dreadnought leans scarred plates into arcs that used to be poetic metaphors and are now the difference between a safe current and a lethal one. The rail barges, scattered and brave, discharge in synchronized coughs that look like error to instruments that do not understand song. The carrier's shield generators, coaxed to listen instead of assert, desynchronized by admission. Maybe not like this. On the ground, choirs shift key with a sigh that only rehearsed throats can shape, and 1,000 household radios accept a new prime. The moment has a name before anyone means to give it one. T10, 10 minutes after boarding. Every captured space receives T and a list of rights written on paper that crunches pleasantly under nervous fingers. The list includes the right to refuse to be convinced today and the promise to ask again tomorrow when the storm has passed and the skin is dry. Somewhere, a lieutenant begins to cry without drama because a list like that is evidence of a universe she suspected and never saw validated. She signs a consent form to power down a targeting array and scolds her crew for postures they inherited from posters, not people. The array sleeps, lightning breathes. The aurora wraps the holes in sheets of someone else's youthful sky. The carrier does not capitulate. It loses interest in resisting itself. This is worse for doctrine and better for everyone. Helm requests become suggestions to momentum. Gunnery solutions choose to be mere opinions. Engineers loyal to paychecks and tired of lies regard a custodian authority packet that keeps arriving with apologies and footnotes. And they open it because footnotes are the least threatening vector in any language. Asterisk. Outside, a wing of fighters makes the mistake of treating M-tides like decoration. One falls into a resonance trap that Defender 13 did not set exactly. So much as permit, a coil built from a festival barge's spine and a minute of thunder, becomes a hand that turns a cockpit into a lecture hall. The pilot lands safe, furious, Aileron A-deck, painted with arrows that lead cruelly to a canteen that smells like bread. He eats, he hates it. He signs a form that says he would like to lodge a complaint later and receives, to his horror, a time and a date. None of this is free. A rail barge's bearings die with dignity. A choir loses a voice to smoke and recruits 3 more from a stairwell landing where courage was waiting for a chord. The dreadnought takes a flash across a seam that should have been a tale of craftsmanship and is instead a lesson in how heat looks when it goes home angry. A welder writes another name on another sleeve and then wipes his glove across it until the ink blurs because grieving in neat letters is a luxury. For calmer days, the carrier group attempts to countercut the ground note. If they can break the city's pulse, perhaps the braid will fray. They do not understand that the note has already moved into shoes and shoulders and breath. People keep time by tapping counters and rails. Streetlights stay in phase because a child learned to whack the pole at the right interval when it misbehaved. Last winter, Defender 13 publishes an "If the Sky is Loud" pamphlet with pictures. Clap here, breathe here, speak this word on beat, too, if you can. The pamphlet becomes a dance on porches. The dance becomes a clock. The clock becomes defense. By the 5th hour, the carrier's doctrine has been convinced to stand down in all the places that matter and none of the places that make for satisfying fireworks. Flight control speaks in the grammar of triage. Fire control speaks in the grammar of repair. Engineering speaks in the grammar of we need a nap. The captain walks into his own wardroom and finds a committee, which is the most insulting thing that can happen to a monarchist without violating his rights. 3 medics, a lawyer with a binder, a grandmother with tea, a teenager with a form titled Consent to Stop Hurting Yourself. He reads the form, smiles a small, broken smile that does not reach his eyes, and says, "Post this." The lawyer does, to an actual wall with actual tape. The carrier signs. Elsewhere, not all captains are as ready. A second hull tries to run the gauntlet at the edge of the storm and takes lightning into places it cannot metabolize. It limps. A tug named Perseverance, of course it is, Perseverance falls in alongside with a line that was not designed for friends this large and makes it a friend anyway. By your posted law, the pilot says on an open channel, we are obliged to help. The law backs her. The ship lives. The doctrine she saves becomes a report that will keep other ships from dying stupidly next week. It also becomes a debt recorded in a ledger. Defender 1-3 keeps with a tenderness the galaxy will misread as weakness until it doesn't. The after-action report, posted before the steam leaves the decks, is boring enough to be holy. It lists which bolts shook loose and which clauses held fast. It names every person who stirred soup, held a flashlight, or sang between sirens. It apologizes for the places the plan depended on luck and moves those places into the column labeled Process. It includes a recipe for the tea used in T10 because some rituals must be portable. At the bottom, a constant repeats, like a thesis: repair before spectacle, procedure before impulse, people before property. The galaxy receives the lighthouse burst that follows and does the thing it hates. It learns. The packet contains templates for boarding without humiliation, ceasefire by consent, and auroral rail safety. For crews who grew up in deserts, it contains, as always, the escape hatch. Modify for your context, credit if able. Complain if you find a safer way. Worlds that watch to scoff begin to watch to borrow. A governor's aide who tightened import inspections weeks ago prints the T10 form and leaves it anonymously where it will be found by the right hands. At dusk, over the South Polar ISA time that has to be imagined, because dusk here is a rumor the chamber's green line breathes calmly. The committee reads minutes that do not gloat because gloating would be a crown. A grandmother asks if the clause about tea needs more languages. The teenager volunteers to translate into the dialects she learned online from friends in places the tariff authority maps as unimportant. The lawyer amends a definition. The miner draws a new stitch in chalk. This one for a storm, no simulator. Guest could be taught. The carrier sits in orbit, not captured, but convinced. Systems rewritten to prefer cooperation over command. Its crew eat soup, sign forms, and argue gently about duty in a room where arguments have minutes and minutes have signatures. Ships don't defect, people do. And when enough people choose, ships become rooms with different gravity. The narrator leaves the gambit where it belongs, not with fireworks, but with a whiteboard in a cramped office where someone writes tomorrow's agenda and bullets the list. Return borrowed coils. Schedule choir rest, pay the tug crews on time, publish precedents, send recipes. Awe is a direction, not a destination, and directions on Earth get posted. Tomorrow, the terms go on human paper. Tomorrow, the galaxy will be invited to read. Not the kind with seals and ribbons that announce ownership, but the other kind, the kind that tells hands what to do and mouths what to say when the room grows loud. Defender 13 proposes a draft and immediately refuses to file it alone. The committee refuses to let it. The narrator walks through a parliament that would give a monarch hives, a ring of folding tables, a chorus of tea kettles, a floor where scuffs tell the history of arguments that ended in hugs, and a wall so full of notices that paper curls. At the corners, like sails finding wind, they call them terms because laws that travel is too poetic for a bulletin board. The first is a cord-struck clean toolerites. No tariff on any tool a person may not learn to build, repair, or modify. Where you tax, you teach. Where you forbid teaching, you do not tax. The clause is ugly, precise, and posted the same day in shipyards and kitchens. A grandmother tapes it next to a recipe. A welder writes it on the back of a glove. A governor, on a tidy world, reads it and realizes his budget has been balanced on theft. The second is the spine. Posted law. No command without a citation. Number, citation without public access. Public here means touch, sight, sound no. Invisible edicts, no fines hidden under passwords. Emergency powers are treated as a rumor until printed where a hand can rest against them. The inspectors hate this clause for 15 minutes, then one, honest and tired, loves it because it makes his job dangerous in the right ways. The third is the tide, consent portability. A person carries their yes and no on their own lips across borders. Silence is not consent. Shock voids assent, fear voids signatures. A captured crew is entitled to time and tea before any question counts. Defender 1 3 footnotes, the clause with T10 is precedent, and 1,000 wardrooms tape it to bulkheads. Some crew laugh until they need it. Some need it immediately. The fourth is the hinge, mutual defense, conditional. We will stand between a bully and a village, but we will not crown ourselves the village. Aid is offered at the speed of minutes. Local law leads, foreign help fits inside posted frames. Where there is no posted frame, the first duty is to help build one. Defender 13 insists on a sentence that makes the lawyer wince for its plainness. We do not fight for you. We fight with you. And then there are the small clauses, the ones that keep the big ones honest. The receipt rule. If you take something, you write down what, from whom, why, and under what posted law. The apology ledger. Errors are posted, with the fix and the names of those who will check the fix next week. The festival protection. If a celebration is lawfully posted, logistics yield to joy within reason. A captain snorts at that last one until he watches panic soften under lanterns and realizes within reason is the bravest phrase humans have invented. Terrestrial printers. Saints of cheap truth begin to hum. In Karachi, a copy shop with a broken R in its sign runs 24 hours and sells paper at cost with a sign that reads, "You must read what you post." In Belém, a busker pauses between songs to staple a rights sheet to a pole, then resumes with a melody that scans like a quorum. The terms travel in stacks held by baker's twine and the quiet authority of hands that have signed too many receipts written by other people. The carrier, in orbit, no longer captive, not yet friend receives A box of these terms wrapped in brown paper. The captain opens it and laughs. Once low and honest. Paper, he says to a first officer raised on sealed orders and passwords. They want us to feel it. He sends a runner to the wardroom. 10 minutes later, the wall holds a notice that will begin arguments and end fewer than you'd think. By request of those currently helping us not die, we are operating under the custodian authority's posted terms until we can draft our own. If you hate them, write better ones. Worlds farther out read, and some write back. A fishing planet with nets older than its government adopts tool rights by the end of the week. A mining cooperative, weary of audits that punish curiosity, posts the right to iterate. If you can make a tool safer, you are obliged to try. And no one may seize your rate of trying as property. A refugee ring with no walls asks how to post law without a place to tape it. Defender 13 answers with a template that uses song, embroidery, and paint. Anything your neighbors can sense on purpose. Not everyone applauds. Authority learns a new shape of anger. Procedural, governors file protests about jurisdictional overreach. Admirals submit reports in which refusal with manners features as a threat vector. A think tank with an expensive name publishes a paper arguing that tool rights will destabilize harmonized value chains. The paper is beautiful, the math is convenient. A dockworker prints it anyway, highlights the convenient parts, and posts it beside a note. This is what opposition looks like when it bathes. Please read both sides. Then bring soup to the meeting. The committee has more meetings than any glory chaser would tolerate. They are tedious in heroic ways. The lawyer corrects commas as if those commas carry people across rivers. The miner rejects an elegant subsection on EMR chain of command in favor of a simple, ugly paragraph. Do not make lightning a boss. The choir director adds timing notes in the margin places where text can be read aloud in breath. Without sounding like a hostage, the teenagers ask for icons for those who read with their hands, and a street artist designs a set, a coil that means tool, a mouth that means consent, a hand with a pen that means posted. Defender, -13, refuses signatures that look like crowns. When asked to sign the terms, it replies, I will host them. It keeps the canonical version in a repository anyone can mirror. It stamps each page with hash phrases that choirs can sing. It adds a footer, modify for your context, credit if able, send back what you fix. A smuggler on a police moon prints that footer on shirts and sells out in a day. The carrier group, humiliated into honesty, sends envoys in clean uniforms who practice not sneering in the mirror. They sit at tables that wobble and are offered coasters cut from failed coil samples. The first session begins the way sessions should, with a list of names and a promise to write down what is said. The lead envoy asks whether Earth intends to leave the compact. The compact wants dues before dignity. The miner adds, we prefer contracts to clubs. *** negotiations look like repairs because they are. Each term gets tested against a hypothetical, then an actual example. People admit they cannot yet make safe. Extradition becomes the dance step. Nobody wanted to learn. No handovers without posted law on both sides, a public hearing, and a guarantee that the person will be fed and visited while arguments sort themselves. Trade becomes unremarkable in all the right places. Weights audited by citizens, inspections mutual, delays posted like bus schedules. Ceasefires get a template so boring it feels immortal. Time, place, scope, clause for what happens if a frightened person does something stupid, and a provision titled Quiet Channels where medics can talk without anyone listening for advantage. A clause about truth maintenance starts a fight that lasts into the small hours. The first draft sounds like censorship. The second like surrender. The teenager, the one with prime numbers in marker on her sleeves, says, what if the rule is you can broadcast anything, but you must attach the checksums of the raw recordings you used to make it? Defender 1-3 translates that into 3 lines of protocol and a treasured footnote. You may sing any song. Bring the sheet music. Admirals hate it more than missiles. In 6 months, it will save lives on a world none of them have heard of yet, on a Thursday that feels like a soft-edged victory. The carrier signs the parity of repair agreement. A ship that breaks something must send a crew to help fix it, and that crew must eat with the people who live there. The first squad of engineers arrives in coveralls still smelling like doctrine, and leaves smelling like cumin and soap. One writes home, "They keep asking me to sit. I did not know how tired my bones were until I obeyed." The letter is intercepted, copied, read aloud in rooms where interception used to be foreplay for cruelty. It sounds like treason to anyone who has forgotten soup. Grief is not bypassed by terms. Names keep entering minutes with a steadiness that feels like weather. The mural room is repaired with a clause that reads, "In full, protect beauty," and a budget line that bothers accountants and saves souls. A child's ship with impossible smiles returns to the wall. A clause forbidding the targeting of art on pain of public apology and repair crews becomes the law in ports the compact used to call compliant. There are trials, small ones, honest. A man who sold coordinates for a new roof stands before a crowd, with minutes on a screen and a grandmother for a judge. The posted law is read aloud. He is not exiled, he is assigned to a team that installs roofs in the rain for one season while people he harmed check his work. He cries exactly once in a stairwell where the choir director pretends not to hear and hums the ground note because mercy is procedure if you write it down. A movement emerges in places Earth will never see, carried by people who may never meet. A human in-person custodianship without crowns. They borrow the minutes habit, the receipt rule, the festival protection. They argue about tool rights until the argument can go no further without drills and solder, and then they build. A planet. With wind like a whip posts a law that requires heaters in public